The atmosphere inside the memorial hall felt heavy and uncertain. The coffin stood in the center of the room beneath a single overhead light. Rex sat beside it now, quiet but alert, as if standing guard. His ears were perked, his eyes focused, and his breathing steady. Alina sat on a nearby bench, her hands clasped tightly, watching both the coffin and the dog's reaction. Deputy Chief Salazar stood at the far end of the room with two senior officers. They spoke in hushed voices, trying to decide what to do next. None of them wanted to disrespect the colonel, but there was no denying that something about this situation was off. After a moment of silence, Salazar made a decision. "Get the medical examiner," he said calmly, "the same one who handled the autopsy, if he's available." An officer rushed out to make the call, while the others stayed behind. Alina walked over and crouched next to Rex, brushing her hand over his fur. "You're trying to protect him, aren't you?" she whispered. Rex responded with a small whine, then looked back at the coffin. He nudged it gently with his nose, then backed away and sat again. 15 minutes later, Dr. Luis Ortega, the chief medical examiner, arrived. He looked surprised to be summoned at the funeral, but listened as Salazar quietly explained the concerns. Ortega frowned. There was nothing suspicious during the examination, he said. "Natural causes. Cardiac arrest." Salazar gave a nod. "Even so, we'd like to take another look." Ortega hesitated. "Are you requesting an exhumation order?" "No," Alina spoke up. "We haven't buried him yet. And that dog," she pointed at Rex, "has worked alongside my father for years. He's never acted like this." Dr. Ortega stared at Rex, then sighed and agreed. Carefully, he and two officers unscrewed the clasps of the coffin's lid. Rex rose to his feet but didn't bark. He watched in silence, tense and ready. As the lid was lifted slowly, a cold air seemed to seep into the room. Everyone held their breath. Inside lay Colonel Victor Ramirez, dressed in full uniform. His face was peaceful, his hands resting across his chest. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Ortega leaned closer, examining the body with practiced eyes. Then he paused. "There's some discoloration on the fingertips," he muttered. Elena's heart skipped. "What does that mean?" Ortega didn't answer immediately. He gently moved the collar of the colonel's shirt and frowned again. "There's a small puncture on the side of the neck. It's faint, but not something I noticed in the first exam." Salazar stepped forward. "Could it be from medical equipment?" "Possibly," Ortega said, "but it doesn't line up with the standard procedure. We didn't use any injections post-mortem." Now, even the most skeptical officers looked concerned. Rex let out a low growl, his eyes never leaving the body. Salazar turned to Alina. "We're going to need to halt the burial until we get answers." Alina nodded, her expression now filled with a strange mix of grief and determination. "Do whatever you have to." Outside the memorial hall, people began to grow restless. The funeral was now delayed beyond the scheduled time. No one knew exactly why, just that something had changed. Inside, the team began preparing the body for transport back to the medical lab for a second autopsy. Salazar gave a quiet order to keep the development confidential until verified. The last thing they needed was rumors spreading before they had facts. As the casket was closed again and gently lifted, Rex followed closely. This time, there was no barking, no growling, just quiet steps and watchful eyes. But something deep within the room had shifted. What had begun as a solemn farewell was now the beginning of a mystery. And Rex, the loyal dog who refused to let his partner's memory be buried without a fight, was leading the way. The second autopsy was scheduled quietly, just a few hours after the funeral was paused. Only a select team of trusted officers and medical professionals were allowed into the secure forensic wing. News had not yet broken to the public, and Salazar intended to keep it that way at least until they knew what they were dealing with. Rex had been allowed to accompany Alina home temporarily, but he refused to rest. He paced around the house, frequently standing at the front door, tail stiff, ears alert. Alina noticed that every time she picked up her phone, Rex seemed to react, as though waiting for a specific call, one that would explain everything. Meanwhile, at the lab, Dr. Ortega and two assistants began their examination. The puncture mark on the colonel's neck now seemed more suspicious. Ortega retrieved tissue samples and sent them for toxicology screening. He was visibly tense. At first, he had been certain the case was straightforward. Now he was questioning whether he had missed something or if someone had intentionally misled him. Deputy Chief Salazar stood nearby, arms folded, watching the process. "You were the one who signed off on the first report," he said. "If there was something there, how did it slip through?" Ortega didn't answer right away. "I followed protocol, but I never saw this mark before. And if it was there, someone could have concealed it before I did my examination." Salazar narrowed his eyes. "You're saying someone tampered with the body?" Ortega hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible." Back at Elena's home, the phone finally rang. "It was Salazar, Elena," he said. "We found a puncture mark that wasn't in the initial records. We're running tests now." She didn't say anything at first. Then she glanced at Rex, who sat beside her, staring up like he already knew. "I want to be there when you get the results," she replied. That evening, Alina arrived at the lab with Rex. The dog remained calm but alert, his focus constantly shifting between the doors and the people. Ortega emerged from the testing room with a clipboard in his hand. His face was pale. "We found traces of a rare compound." He began, "a muscle relaxant. It doesn't show up easily unless you're looking for it. It can slow the heart and breathing until it appears like natural heart failure." Salazar looked stunned. "So it wasn't a heart attack, it might have been induced," Ortega said carefully. The amount was small, but lethal in someone his age. Alina felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. Then this wasn't natural. Someone did this to him. There was a heavy silence in the room. Salazar turned to Ortega. "This changes everything. We need the chain of custody logs. Who handled the body before the autopsy, and who had access to the report?" Ortega nodded. "I'll get the files. But there's something else." He led them into a storage room where archived case reports were kept. A specific folder had been flagged. Inside, they found a printed copy of the colonel's preliminary autopsy report. Strangely, a page was missing, one that detailed signs of trauma and circulation status. Ortega looked confused. "I swear that page was there when I submitted the report," he said. "I don't understand." Salazar took a deep breath. "Someone didn't just tamper with the body. They tampered with the paperwork, too." Alina turned to Rex. "You knew something was wrong. You knew before any of us did." The dog wagged his tail slightly but remained quiet. Back at police headquarters, Salazar launched a discreet internal inquiry. They began questioning everyone who had access to the colonel's body during the 48 hours after his passing. That included medical staff, forensic assistants, even high-ranking officers. Within hours, a name came up repeatedly: Officer Miguel Duarte, a logistics supervisor who had been in charge of transferring the colonel's body to the morgue, and oddly enough, Duarte hadn't shown up to the funeral. Salazar looked at the list again, then picked up the phone. "Find him," he ordered. "Now." As the search began, Alina returned home with Rex, her thoughts racing. Her father had always said that corruption hides where you least expect it, and now, his trusted canine had just opened a door no one knew existed. What started as a funeral was quickly turning into an investigation, and the answers, it seemed, were only beginning to surface. The sun was barely up when the search for Officer Miguel Duarte officially began. Salazar had dispatched a small, trusted team to locate him quietly, knowing that word of the second autopsy would soon leak. It was only a matter of time before the media caught wind of the paused funeral and the investigation it triggered, but Miguel Duarte was not at home. His neighbors said they hadn't seen him since the day before the funeral. His phone was off, his apartment locked from the outside, and his department-issued vehicle was gone. It didn't feel like coincidence, it felt like someone who had decided to disappear. By mid-morning, Salazar stood in the situation room at headquarters, staring at a digital board of names, dates, and movements. The deeper they dug, the more questions emerged. The logs showed that Duarte had signed off on transporting the colonel's body to the morgue after it left the hospital. But there was a 7-hour gap between when the body left the hospital and when it arrived at the forensics center. According to the paperwork, Duarte was the only officer present during that entire time. "That's not a delay," Salazar muttered under his breath. "That's a window." Alina had arrived at the station with Rex by her side. Though she wasn't officially part of the force, Salazar had given her permission to sit in on briefings. Knowing her connection to the case was too deep to ignore, Rex lay quietly at her feet as she listened to the growing list of irregularities. He was preparing a report. She said suddenly, "My father, I remember he mentioned it last week. Something big, something that had to go directly to internal affairs." Salazar turned toward her. "Do you know where he kept it?" "He didn't trust digital backups for sensitive cases," she said. "He always printed hard copies and kept them in a locked drawer at home." Salazar nodded. "Let's go." They drove straight to the colonel's house, a quiet, modest home tucked behind rows of trees. Alina used her own key to open the front door. Everything was just as her father had left it, tidy, purposeful, unassuming. She walked straight to the study. There, in the bottom drawer of his desk, was a steel lockbox. The key was hidden under the desk lamp base, exactly where he always told her to keep it. She unlocked the box with trembling hands. Inside were several files, sealed envelopes, and a handwritten note with a date that matched 4 days before his death. Alina unfolded the note and read it aloud. "If something happens to me, don't trust the first story. Look at what's buried, not what's presented." Below that line were several case numbers, scribbled quickly in his unmistakable handwriting. Salazar opened one of the envelopes and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were photos, receipts, and a ledger showing illegal payments routed through. A land registry office. There were names, account numbers, and even surveillance photos, some of them showing Officer Miguel Duarte in meetings with unknown individuals. This is it, Salazar said quietly. This is why they wanted him silent. Alina looked down at the floor, the weight of realization sinking in. He was going to expose them. Rex let out a low grumble and stood up suddenly, moving toward the study window. A moment later, they heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. Salazar stepped to the side, hand instinctively going to his weapon. A black SUV had pulled into the driveway. It had no markings, but the men inside didn't look like delivery drivers. Stay behind me, Salazar said. Rex growled louder now, fur bristling as he positioned himself between Alina and the door. The front passenger stepped out of the SUV, wearing a dark coat and an expression to calm for the situation. Salazar stepped outside, keeping one hand near his belt. Can I help you? The man smiled politely. We're looking for Alina Ramirez. She's not available, Salazar replied coldly. And you're on private property. The man gave a nod, like he expected that answer. Understood. Tell her to be careful who she trusts. He got back into the SUV, and the vehicle pulled away without another word. Back inside, Alina stood by the window, her face pale. Who were they? She whispered. Salazar turned away from the door. People who don't like the truth getting too close. Alina looked down at Rex, who stood calm again but watchful. And for the first time in days, she understood just how deep her father had been pulled into something dangerous. And now, she and Rex were in it too. That night, Alina sat at the kitchen table, flipping through her father's files while Rex dozed. At her feet, every document she read made her chest feel heavier. The ledgers and photos in the lockbox pointed to a vast real estate, scam abandoned properties in rural zones being revived on paper, then sold off to shell companies linked to city officials. Her father had compiled names, accounts, and even internal memos, but it wasn't just financial fraud. Some of the documents hinted at disappearances, people who had challenged the scheme and then vanished quietly, written off as runaways or unrelated losses. It was becoming painfully clear why someone would have wanted Colonel Ramirez silenced. And Rex, always silent but watchful, had been the only one to recognize something was wrong before anyone else. Salazar returned to the house just past midnight. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp. We found Duarte, he said. Alina. Saturday, up straight, where he crossed the border into a small town on the coast. Someone tipped off customs. He's in custody, but barely talking. Barely, Alina asked. Salazar gave a slow nod. Just one thing, he said. I never wanted it to go that far. I didn't know they'd do that to him. Then he shut down. Alina closed her eyes for a second. So he admits there was a plan, maybe not directly, but it confirms suspicion. He pulled out a small digital recorder and slid it across the table. Here's the part where he mentions the hospital. He says the colonel was never taken straight to the morgue. Instead, he was driven to a private clinic just outside the city. Alina opened her eyes. What happened there? No records. But now we think they used that time to inject the drug and fabricate the death certificate. Someone inside the system helped make it all look clean. Rex let out a low, muffled bark. He stood and moved toward the hallway. Alert again. Alina turned, listening carefully. There was a faint knock at the front door. Salazar moved quickly, hand near his holster. When he opened it, he found Officer Lydia Ramos, young, sharp, and one of the few officers Elena's father had trusted. She stepped inside quickly and closed the door behind her. I know I wasn't supposed to come here directly, she said, but you need to see this. She handed Salazar a flash drive. Security footage from the night the colonel's body was in the transfer unit. I had to pull some favors to get it. They plugged it into Elena's laptop. The video showed a dim corridor outside a refrigerated storage room. The timestamp was between 2:14 and 2:47 a.m. Hours before the body arrived at the official morgue, a shadowy figure entered the room with a metal case. A few minutes later, he left, visibly adjusting something in his coat. The face wasn't clear, but the build, posture, and walk were familiar. That's Ortega, Salazar said grimly. The medical examiner, Alina asked, stunned. He said he didn't know anything. He lied, Salazar said. He was part of it, probably paid to misreport the autopsy. He must have handled the injection and helped clean up the evidence. Lydia leaned closer. If Ortega tampered with the body before the official records began, it explains how the first autopsy missed the puncture. He made it look like there was never anything wrong. Alina stood slowly. We need to confront him. Salazar hesitated. We will, but carefully. If he knows we're onto him, he could disappear like Duarte tried to. Alina didn't answer. She looked down at Rex, who stared back at her with those intelligent, knowing eyes. He had never stopped trying to get someone to listen. He had barked at the coffin, not from confusion, but from certainty. Rex had seen something, smelled something. He knew from the beginning that what was buried wasn't just a lie. Salazar placed a call to Internal Affairs and asked for an immediate, silent surveillance order on Dr. Ortega. Meanwhile, he ordered the colonel's body be preserved in protective custody until a third supervised autopsy could be conducted. The truth was finally coming to the surface. But with every name they uncovered, it became clearer that this wasn't just a case of one man's murder. It was a network, and at its center, a dog's loyalty had pulled the first thread. By the following morning, the city's news cycle had caught wind of the disruption at Colonel Ramirez's funeral. Rumors spread fast. Some claimed it was due to a medical complication. Others whispered about a family dispute. No one knew the real reason. Only a small circle understood that a dog's relentless barking had pulled at a thread that now risked unraveling powerful secrets. Alina stood in her father's study, surrounded by files he never had the chance to publish. Every paper she picked up added weight to the truth. Her father had been close, very close to exposing something big. And now, his closest colleague, Dr. Luis Ortega, was under suspicion of helping cover up his death. Deputy Chief Salazar stepped into the room. Internal Affairs confirmed Ortega has been making calls he didn't log in the department system. He said he's nervous. Alina didn't look up. How long until you confront him? We'll bring him in tonight. Quietly, but as the day unfolded, the case took another unexpected turn. An officer from tech support, assigned to go through Ortega's emails and call logs, discovered a series of encrypted messages sent between Ortega and a private medical lab registered under a company called Virulin Diagnostics. On paper, the lab specialized in advanced testing for rare conditions. But digging deeper revealed that the facility had received a large payment from a government account 2 days before the colonel's death. Salazar frowned as he reviewed the report. That's too clean. They laundered the transaction through health funding. Lydia, seated at the desk beside him, pointed at one of the flagged transfers. And this account number matches one of the shell companies your father listed, she told Alina. Alina's hands tightened around her coffee mug. He already connected the dots. They just made sure the last line was never written. Rex, now lying by the door, lifted his head. As if sensing the rise in tension, he stood and walked toward Alina. She knelt down beside him, whispering, "We're getting closer. Boy, you were right from the beginning." Later that evening, Ortega was picked up under the pretense of a routine interview. No arrest, no charges, just a conversation in a controlled room. Alina watched the interrogation through a two-way mirror. Ortega sat calm at first, his hands folded, posture relaxed. But the moment Salazar placed a printed photo of the surveillance footage from the morgue in front of him, his composure cracked. He shifted in his seat. His fingers began to tap restlessly. Spoke softly. "You had access to the body, and we know now there was a 7-hour gap when Duarte didn't take it to the morgue. You were the only other person who could have touched it during that time." Ortega didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and the private diagnostics received a large transfer tied to your name. Still no answer. Salazar leaned forward. "He was your friend. You had dinner with him 2 nights before he died. Don't tell me you thought this was just about silencing a report." Ortega finally looked up. His eyes were tired, and there was no defiance, only defeat. "I didn't know they'd go that far," he said. "I was told it was a warning, something to scare him, just enough to get him to stop." Alina stepped away from the mirror. Her chest felt hollow. Her father had trusted Ortega. They had worked together for years. And now, the betrayal came with a confession too late to matter. Salazar kept his voice even. "You helped them, whether you intended it or not. You cleaned up their mess." Ortega nodded slowly. "I know." As Internal Affairs prepared charges and took Ortega into custody, Alina walked outside into the station courtyard, needing air. Rex followed, sitting beside her as she stared at the sky. "They got to him because he was too close," she said quietly, "and he trusted the wrong people." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded copy of her father's last note, the one he left in the lockbox. "If something happens to me, don't trust the first story." They hadn't, and now, one of the key players had confessed. But something still didn't sit right. There were too many names missing, too many threads left hanging. And Rex.com, now, but watchful, seemed to sense it too. The following morning, the city woke up to headlines they weren't prepared for. News outlets had caught wind of Dr. Ortega's quiet arrest. And while official statements were vague, the public was already speculating. The idea that Colonel Victor Ramirez's death may not have been from natural causes sent shockwaves across the city. People who had once trusted every word of the original report now began to ask their own questions. But behind the scenes, the investigation was moving even faster. In one of the digital folders recovered from Ortega's cloud backup, tech analysts found a redacted version of the original autopsy report, complete with timestamps that showed it had been edited more than once. The most critical section had been removed, the toxicology screen. Not only had Ortega tampered with the body, he had also altered the report electronically, carefully omitting the blood work that showed the injected muscle relaxant. Salazar stood in the forensic tech room reviewing the metadata on the file. He deleted this the night before the funeral, he said, but the backup server kept a cached copy. Alina, standing beside him, nodded slowly. He tried to erase my father's death like it was just a clerical error. She looked down at her phone and opened the image of her father's handwritten note again. There was something else that had always bothered her. One of the case numbers in his final message didn't appear to connect to the land fraud documents. Curious, she typed it into the internal case file system. To her surprise, the number linked to an old unresolved missing person, Fila Young, man named Gabriel Esquivel, who had vanished 5 years ago. After filing complaints against a zoning board in a nearby district, the original report had no suspects, no progress, and had been quietly closed 2 years later. Alina Salazar said slowly, looking over her shoulder, "Your father didn't just find corruption, he found disappearances." Rex, who had been resting near the door, suddenly stood up and walked toward the desk. He placed his paw on the edge of a file folder, one that hadn't yet been opened. Alina picked it up and flipped it open. Inside were surveillance photos taken from a parking garage camera. In the center of one image was Officer Duarte, and beside him, shockingly, was someone who matched Gabriel Esquivel's description. Elena's eyes widened. Wait, this doesn't make sense. That picture was dated just a month before my father died. Salazar looked at the label again. If that's really Gabriel, then he didn't disappear. He went underground. Or someone made it look like he vanished. They immediately reached out to the missing person unit and requested access to old interview logs. One officer recalled that Gabriel had accused several people of bribery and manipulation of rural zoning permits. He was last seen leaving a municipal meeting after telling his sister that he had found something big. Now, it appeared that Gabriel had re-emerged long enough to speak with someone, maybe even with Colonel Ramirez. The team pulled cell tower data around the parking garage from that day and cross-referenced it with the colonel's records. Sure enough, his number pinged a tower in the same area at the exact same time. Salazar exhaled sharply. They met. Your father met Gabriel. Elena's voice was tight. And that means my father knew Gabriel was alive. Maybe he promised to protect him, maybe. That's why they came after him. Suddenly, it all made sense. The land scheme wasn't just about money, it was about silence. The people behind it weren't only stealing. They were erasing anyone who tried to stop them. Rex let out a sharp bark. Salazar turned to the board. We've been treating your father's death as the final crime. But it was meant to be the warning shot. He was too close to blowing it wide open. Alina stared at the map of names and photos pinned to the wall. We need to find Gabriel. If he's alive, he's the last piece. Salazar nodded. I'll issue a quiet trace request. We'll keep it off the grid. Outside the window, storm clouds were rolling in, casting a shadow across the station courtyard. Alina placed her hand gently on Rex's head. You knew, didn't you? She whispered. You knew he wasn't done fighting. And neither was she. The rain started just before dawn, a slow drizzle that turned the city's rooftops slick and gray. Inside police headquarters, the investigative team was wide awake, working through every lead. Salazar had initiated a low-profile trace on Gabriel Esquivel, but results were slow. He needed to be careful if anyone inside the department was still involved in the cover-up. They couldn't afford to alert them. Meanwhile, Alina and Rex were reviewing her father's case files for the 100th time. Tucked between two unrelated folders, Alina noticed something odd. A receipt for a prepaid locker rental at a train station across town. The date on the slip was the same day her father died. Her pulse quickened. Salazar, she called as she entered the operations room. My father rented a locker the day he died, and he didn't tell anyone about it. I think whatever he was hiding, it's there. Salazar didn't hesitate. Let's go. They arrived at the train station just before the morning rush. It was quiet, the kind of place people passed through without noticing each other. Locker number 43B was at the far end of a dim corridor. Alina inserted the key. It clicked smoothly, like it had been waiting for them all along. Inside was a thick manila envelope, sealed and labeled with just one word, Gabriel. Alina opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, a USB drive, and a letter written in her father's handwriting. Gabriel came to me afraid. He had evidence, audio, contracts, names. I told him to disappear for a while until I could hand this over. If you're reading this, I never got the chance. But you must finish it. She read it aloud in a trembling voice. Salazar looked over her shoulder and scanned the USB drive's contents on his laptop. His eyes widened as the first file loaded on audio recording of a secret meeting. The voices were clear. One of them belonged to a man now serving as deputy director of the zoning commission. Another was unmistakably the voice of Officer Miguel Duarte. They were discussing payouts, forged documents, and what to do if Gabriel went public. Salazar leaned back. This is it. This isn't just circumstantial, this is enough to charge half a dozen people. Elena's face was pale. Gabriel trusted my father with this. That's why he was targeted. That's why they tried to silence him. Salazar reached for his phone. We're going public. Within hours, the district attorney had authorized a series of arrest warrants based on the newly uncovered evidence. Officers, officials, and even one retired zoning executive were taken into custody. The story broke across every major news outlet by nightfall, but even in the storm of arrests, one question remained unanswered: where was Gabriel now? Later that evening, as Alina and Salazar debriefed with internal affairs, an unexpected call came through. A man identifying himself only as Daniel asked for Alina by name. He gave no surname, just a message. "Tell her I still have the backup files. She'll know where to find me." Then the line went dead. Alina froze. Her hands began to shake. "That's him," she said. "That was Gabriel." Salazar looked at her. "Do you know what he meant?" She nodded. "Yes, there's a farmhouse in the hills, my father's old retreat. He took me there as a kid. It had no phone line, no Wi-Fi, completely off-grid. He once told me if I ever need to vanish, that's where I'll be." They set out, immediately, accompanied by a small team and Rex in the back seat. The road leading into the hills was muddy from the rain, but the SUV pushed through. As they neared the property, Rex suddenly lifted his head and gave a single bark. Salazar slowed the vehicle. He senses something. The gate to the old farmhouse stood open, swaying in the wind. The windows were dark, but as they approached the porch, a figure stepped out from the shadows, thin, bearded, and wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Alina recognized him instantly. "Gabriel," she whispered. He nodded. "I thought you'd come." Rex approached him cautiously, sniffed, then sat beside him like he knew the man had been part of this story from the beginning. Gabriel held out a weathered hard drive. "This has everything more than what was in the locker. Your father told me to hold on to it until someone he trusted came for it." Tears filled Elena's eyes. "He died protecting you." Gabriel looked down. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure his death wasn't for nothing." The farmhouse was cold and quiet, but inside, the atmosphere was electric. Gabriel and Alina sat across from each other, the hard drive between them like a fragile lifeline to truth. Salazar and two officers kept watch near the entrance, while Rex lay at Elena's feet, alert and calm. "We have everything we need now," Gabriel said quietly. "This hard drive contains emails, recordings, financial transfers, proof of a network that reaches into the highest levels of the zoning commission, law enforcement, and even some politicians." Alina nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat. "My father put his life on the line to expose this. We owe him more than just words." Salazar spoke from the doorway. "I am already working with the district attorney. With this evidence, we'll bring them all down." The next few days were a whirlwind. Arrests followed, investigations expanded, and the city held its breath. Alina attended every press conference, standing quietly behind Salazar as they laid out the facts. The public's response was overwhelming. People praised Colonel Ramirez's courage and the dog who refused to be silent. Rex, once just a loyal companion, became a symbol of justice itself. But amid the celebration, Alina felt a quiet sadness. Her father would never see the full story told. He would never see the peace that came from finally unmasking the corruption. One afternoon, as the city began to settle, Alina returned to the police memorial ground where the funeral had been held. She knelt beside the freshly placed headstone. "You, Rex," she whispered. The dog rested his head on her knee, his eyes gentle but wise. Together, they watched as the wind rustled the trees, carrying away the last shadows of a secret long buried. Salazar approached quietly. "There's one more thing." Alina looked up, curious. "The department has officially recognized your father's service with a posthumous medal. And Rex," he smiled, "will be awarded a special commendation for his role in uncovering the truth." Alina smiled softly, tears welling. "He deserves it." Days later, a small ceremony was held at police headquarters. Rex sat proudly beside Alina as she accepted the medal on his behalf. Officers and officials applauded. But the moment belonged to the silent dog who barked when no one else would. That night, back at her father's house, Alina sat by the fireplace with Rex resting at her feet. The room was quiet except for the crackling fire. "He saved so many lives," she said softly. "And he saved you." Rex lifted his head and looked at her with the kind of knowing only a loyal friend can have. Years later, Alina would tell the story of Colonel Victor Ramirez and Rex the dog who barked nonstop at a funeral, refusing to let a lie rest in peace. Because sometimes, truth isn't just spoken. Sometimes, it's barked.